as it were, to these other kinds of objects. Inattentional blindness is interesting because it reveals a property of attention that people hadn't really focused on before. When psychologists talk about attention, almost always they're talking about attention to a location in space. Remember Cherry's version of the cocktail party phenomenon? You're paying attention to somebody at a cocktail party. You're looking at him. You're paying attention to what he or she is saying. That's attention driven to a particular part of space. You're not paying attention to anything else going on. But inattentional blindness seems to suggest, since this object, to which about a quarter of subjects are blind, they just don't see it, is appearing in the same region of space as the things they are paying attention to. Inattentional blindness seems to suggest that there is both spatial attention and object-based attention. That is, you can pay attention to objects, not just to regions of space. And this inattentional blindness can be quite dramatic, as revealed in a famous experiment, notorious experiment now, called Gorillas in Our Midst, in which subjects are given a task of watching a ball-tossing game, and what they're supposed to do is to count the number of times the ball is exchanged between players in the white T-shirts and players in the dark T-shirts. It's a fairly simple task, and subjects are just asked to count the number of ball tosses that occur. What's interesting about this is, in this experiment, the experimenters had a Confederate, it was a Confederate, okay, dressed in a gorilla suit, walk through the group, okay, as they're tossing this ball back and forth. And then at the end, after the subjects reported the number of ball tosses that they had counted, the experimenters simply said, well, did you notice anything else? And a relatively large proportion of subjects, not quite half in one experiment anyway, reported nothing. I didn't see anything at all. They didn't see a guy in a gorilla suit walking through this group. And the reason they didn't see the guy in the gorilla suit walking through this group, apparently, is that they were paying so much attention to the objects, the people in the white T-shirts, the people in the blue T-shirts, the ball being tossed back and forth, that they simply didn't pay any attention to this gorilla. And there are lots of other examples of this. There's an earlier version of this experiment in which a woman carrying an open umbrella walks through the group. And you get the same kind of thing. It's a dramatic example of inattentional blindness. And what Mack and Rock thought this was quite important, because what inattentional blindness reflects is a failure to consciously perceive an object, okay, that's otherwise salient. There's nothing subliminal about the gorilla. There's no masking of the gorilla or anything like that. He's right there. And if it weren't for your attention being paid to something else, you would see it very clearly. So it's a failure to consciously perceive an object that's otherwise salient because the subject's attention and expectation are both otherwise engaged. The subject's task is to compare the lengths of lines, and that's what they expect to see. Because there have been a whole bunch of trials when all they saw were lines, and so they don't see anything else. This led Mack and Rock to kind of an astounding conclusion, an important conclusion, which is that nothing is perceived without attention. Nothing is consciously perceived without attention. If you don't attend to the object, whether it's spatial attention or object-based attention, doesn't matter. If you don't attend to the object, you don't consciously perceive it. You have a question?
Yeah, I felt like him that it's because the gorilla does look a lot like a black
Well, he's a lot hairier. Okay. Yeah, okay, there's a trick in the experiment. Okay, he does look a little bit more like the black team, but the ball is never tossed to him, okay? The ball is tossed past him and all that. You ought to be able to see the gorilla. Everybody see the gorilla? Huh? Yeah. Yeah, well, he does all sorts of he does all sorts of things. So it's not just that people are confused about who's on the blue team and who's a gorilla, though I do think that helps. Okay, again, there are a lot of times there are tricks in these experiments. In the original Neisser and Beckland experiment, it was a woman in a long Victorian dress carrying a parasol walking through the group, and she's impossible to confuse with any of the players. Okay, so there we go. Nothing is consciously perceived without attention, which raises the question of what might be unconsciously perceived even in the absence of attention. Is there implicit perception of things like the unexpected third object in the Mack and Rock experiments, or for that matter, of the gorilla? If so, then you'd have evidence for unconscious perception without attention, even if there's no conscious perception without attention. And to make a long story short, of course, there is priming. What Mack and Rock did in one of their experiments was to present words instead of just a little block at the edges of one quadrant or another. And what you can see here is really this is stem completion performance. And when subjects are giving their full attention to the prime, of course, there's a big priming effect. When the prime is presented in very close to the fovea, you get a very big priming effect in people who don't show inattentional blindness. Remember, about 75% of subjects see the other object, okay? They don't show inattentional blindness, and you get a nice priming effect from them. But even for the subjects who show inattentional blindness, you get a priming effect, smaller, but it's still there, compared to baseline, okay? And when the prime is presented parafoveally, that is, displaced further and further from the center of attention, again, for the subjects who don't show inattentional blindness, you see a priming effect here. It's reduced, but it's still there compared to baseline. And even for the subjects who do show inattentional blindness, you can see this priming effect. Now, this is stem completion priming. This is repetition priming. This is priming based on the physical resemblance between the prime and the target. Priming that could be mediated just by a perception-based representation of the prime. What about semantic priming, which, as I've argued before, is the real test of pre-attentive processing? It's not interesting. It's not particularly interesting that you get a repetition priming or perception-based priming. What's really interesting about pre-attentive processing is if you can get semantic priming. And you can, okay? Here, what happens is that we're looking at what's known as word picture priming. There is a word presented in the inattentively blind spot, and then later on there's a picture and the subjects are simply supposed to name it. So you might say it's umbrella or table or whatever presented down there, and then a picture of an umbrella or a table or some control stimulus like a chair or a shotgun or something like that is presented. The subject simply has to name what the picture is. There is a phenomenon known as word picture priming, which is kind of obvious when you think about it for 6.5 seconds, which is that if you prime somebody with the word that represents the picture, they find it easier to identify what the picture is. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. But notice that that's not repetition priming. That's got to be semantic priming. When you see the word umbrella, you understand its meaning, and you have some idea about what that object looks like, and it's that additional semantic priming that causes the priming effect in word picture priming. And what you can see here, first, in full attention, where the subjects are not distracted by anything at all, you get this huge priming effect compared to baseline. When you divide attention, so you're distracting the subjects while they're doing this, you still get, for the inattentionally blind, for the not inattentionally blind subjects, you get a nice priming effect. but you still get one for the inattentionally blind subjects compared to baseline. And that's true if the word is masked or it's unmasked. So however you do the experiment, you're getting word picture priming, a priming effect that has to be mediated by some kind of semantic processing of the unnoticed, unattended word. Okay? So that's basically how that goes. This is a phenomenon known as inattentional blindness, and it's named that way because one way or another, subjects are simply not paying attention to this thing down here that creates the priming effect. It turns out that there are also phenomena of attentional blindness, where people are paying attention to the area of space where the object, where the prime appears, and they're also expecting it to occur, but they still sometimes don't see it. Here, what you've got is what's known as attentional blindness, what I'm trying to call attentional blindness now, which is like inattentional blindness with a big difference. Okay, here you've got a failure to consciously perceive an object, where the attention failure, the failure of conscious perception, does not depend on the fact that the subject's attention is being directed to some other region of space, like parafoveal perception or dichotic listening, or for that matter, inattentional blindness, or to some other object, which is clearly the case in inattentional blindness. So subjects are paying attention, and the prime appears there, and they still don't see it. So what you've got in these cases of attentional blindness is a lack of conscious perception despite attention. And this comes in various forms. And again, the question is going to be, okay, you don't get conscious perception in these cases. Can you get unconscious perception? Can you get priming effects that reflect implicit unconscious perception of the prime? I'll show you two of these phenomena. There we go. This is what's known as repetition blindness. Repetition blindness. And it occurs in a particular kind of experimental paradigm called RSVP, which stands for Rapid Serial Visual Presentation. Subjects are looking at a computer screen. They're looking right at the area where some words are going to appear, and words appear one at a time, in very rapid succession in the center of the screen. This is a phenomenon discovered by Nancy Kanwisher, now at Harvard University, and it goes like this. You've got this sentence, and these words appear one at a time. It was work time, so work had to get done. Okay? And in this procedure, the subjects are asked to watch out for particular words. There are a whole bunch of these sentences that are presented to subjects, and they're supposed to press a button whenever they see a particular word. And what you can see here, the trick is that the word work is presented twice in this sentence. Okay, and it turns out that when you present subjects with a sentence like that, they'll notice the first presentation of the word work, but they will not notice the second presentation of the word work. They'll get the meaning of the sentence, kind of, but they won't say that they saw the word work. This is known as repetition blindness,